On today's show, who are the most interesting buyers and sellers ahead of this year's NBA trade deadline? Which buyers are one move away and which sellers have the best players available? It's all coming up right here at Locked On NBA Game Night.
When that final buzzer rings, you know it's time for Locked On NBA Game Night. All the post-game reactions to every game across the league, every single night, with insights only the hosts at Locked On can provide. It's the true NBA fans' one stop for all the action. Every game, every night. It's Locked On NBA Game Night. Tipping off now.
What is up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On NBA Game Night. Every game, every night. But tonight, David, we have no games. There's no games on the slate. So instead, we are talking to you about the best and most interesting buyers and sellers ahead of this year's NBA trade deadline. Which buyers are one move away and which sellers have the best players, the most interesting players available. We're going to get into all of that and so much more on today's show. I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, also host of Locked On Rockets right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Joining me, it's my partner in crime, going through his own version of his own flu game right now, David Ramil, host of Locked On Heat. David, how are you holding up, man?
I'm doing great, ready to talk some potential trades because it just feels like lots of teams are right there. I mean, there's so much parity around the league, and it feels like it might be a very active trade deadline.
Absolutely, and it's that time of year, right? December-ish is kind of when the rumor mill really starts to churn, and you start to hear about all these different players who may or may not be on the move. You get certain trade requests out there. You are unfortunately very familiar with that, with Jimmy Butler and his sunny disposition with the Miami Heat currently. So he's definitely one of the names that we're going to be talking about here in just one moment. We want to thank you for making Locked On NBA Game Night your first listen every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And I guess, David, that's as good a place as any for us to get started here on our buyers and sellers show is kind of what the current situation is with the Miami Heat and Jimmy Butler, because I think he's arguably the biggest, I guess, star player available at this deadline. You can maybe make the argument Zion is a bigger name, obviously with the injury history and everything going on there. He's not going to be the guy that's going to be moving a needle for any time soon, it feels, or for any team anytime soon, it feels like. So right now, I mean, I don't think we can really quantify the Heat as sellers, right? They're just kind of in this Jimmy Butler pickle that they're trying to figure out.
Yeah, you could almost put them in either category. There might be sellers, there might be buyers. And the Jimmy situation is so unique, though, because obviously, for those not familiar with the details, he's got 1 year left on his contract. It's an option year. And everybody is inclined to believe that he's going to opt out of that this summer and become an unrestricted free agent, meaning that he wants to sign a contract extension for undisclosed amounts of money. We have no idea. His agent says max money. Jimmy has said, I have enough money. I don't really need it. Nobody knows what's going on. And on top of all this, there's Jimmy and some tension perhaps with the team. There's the fact that he's 35 years old and no one's quite sure whether or not he's going to continue to produce at a high level. And so that just kind of provides this dark cloud hanging over everything. And so with the Heat front office perspective, they might have to trade Jimmy Butler because they don't want to lose him for nothing, rather at the start of the summer. But they're also interested in winning now. And so either they're going to trade him for a win now type player, which doesn't seem realistic either, because why would you acquire a player of Jimmy Butler's stature in order to win this season and give up another player that might be able to help you win at the same time? So it just doesn't seem like there's an ideal trade available for Jimmy. It just makes the whole situation really, really confusing and hard to figure out.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I mean, is the best trade offer for Jimmy? We know that they're, the Phoenix Suns have started to throw their hat in the ring. They're thinking, okay, well, we'd love to, get our hands on Jimmy Butler, but in order for the Suns to be able to facilitate a Jimmy Butler trade, they would have to include Bradley Beal, who still possesses a no trade clause in his contract, which is the whole, issue with trading for Bradley Beal in the first place and why he's widely viewed as one of the worst contracts currently in the NBA. So that's a significant roadblock in potentially acquiring Jimmy Butler. Is the best offers on the table still currently the Golden State Warriors? That's another team that very clearly are looking to be buyers ahead of this deadline. I don't know how many more moves we can expect them to potentially make. They just picked up Dennis Schroeder for a couple future second round picks to bolster their bench unit. Is a Jimmy Butler to Golden State trade the best available path forward for really both of these teams?
For Miami, it doesn't seem like the proposed deal that would revolve around Jonathan Kuminga would be the kind of deal that Miami would try to make, because Kuminga seems like he's still an unknown at this point and has his own contract situation. So Miami would, in theory, want some kind of cap flexibility, and they might not get that if they have to, again, potentially deal with re-signing Kuminga this summer too. So, I mean, we went through a litany of different potential trade offers or trade, partners with Miami in yesterday's episode of Locked On Heat. You should definitely go check that out. Unfortunately for you, it seems like one of the teams that might have the ideal package would be the Houston Rockets, because they've got a combination of picks and players and matching salaries or movable salaries that could make a deal for Jimmy Butler somewhat more palatable for the Heat front office. But it's just, as far as the Warriors are concerned, again, you've got Kuminga, you've got Andrew Wiggins. I don't know whether that makes Miami a worse team or a decent team, or whether or not that would be viewed as a win now type move. And it's so hard in a vacuum to kind of just say what Miami's perspective on all this, because we keep hearing that they want fair value for Jimmy Butler, but I have no idea how to gauge what fair value is, because although he's a superstar name, again, with his free agency concerns, with his contract demands, with his age, and the questions about his durability and ability to produce at a high level moving forward, there's so many variables here that's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly what fair value for a player of his stature is.
The Heat are in this really just awful pickle right now, where, again, you want to still be competitive. You want, ideally like a soft retool around, Tyler Herro, Bam Adebayo, and staying competitive in a kind of an Eastern Conference that's easier to be a little competitive in, near the bottom or kind of the lower end of the standings. I mean, as to your point about the Rockets' potential interest in Jimmy Butler, I will happily squash that here. I would be absolutely floored if the Rockets trade for a mid-30s Jimmy Butler with any combination of their young talent or expiring deals or anything. They might be in position to make a move like that, but all signs that I've heard are pointing towards the Houston Rockets. They want to stand pat. They are an interesting potential buyer at this NBA trade deadline, though, because they do have just north of $40 million in expiring contracts or team-controlled contracts in order to be able to make some kind of a move at this deadline, but it doesn't feel like it's going to be Jimmy Butler. Now, this other team that has been in the running, there's the Warriors, there's the Suns. The Mavericks are one other team that have been linked to Jimmy. Is there a deal there that you could see working for both teams, or not? Or is it just the same situation here where it's hard to make it work for both sides?
Yeah, similar to what you just said about the Rockets. They would have to give up a player that they probably wouldn't want to. There's some contracts there that they might be able to. Maxi Kleber would be one of them, but I think Miami would probably wind up sticking to wanting PJ Washington because there's a positional need for him on this roster. In theory, if you trade Jimmy Butler, you could kind of slide Jaime Jaquez into the small forward position, but you need to shore up that forward spot at the 4. And so that's why PJ Washington would be somebody Miami would want in return. But I don't think Dallas is willing to move him, according to Nick Angstad, host of Locked On Mavericks. So, yeah, it just doesn't seem like there's a real move to be made for Jimmy. My feeling is that personally he's going to wind up staying in Miami, and then they're just going to wind up losing him at some point this summer, or try to negotiate some kind of long-term deal for significantly less than the max money that his agent seems to think that he might get somewhere.
Coming up, two of the other big sellers at the NBA trade deadline, the New Orleans Pelicans. What happens with Zion Williamson, Brandon Ingram, and pretty much half their roster seems like it's on the trade block at this point, and the Chicago Bulls, Nikola Vucevic and Zach LaVine. Could LaVine be headed to the Mile High City? We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by Built Rewards. Look, if you're a renter, you need to listen up. This is a total game changer. Thanks to Built, you can now earn points on rent payments just like you do with groceries or travel. Paying rent now comes with serious perks, and it's completely free to join. Earn valuable Built points on your rent and everyday spending at no extra cost. You redeem points for flights, hotel stays, and even future rent payments. With over 500 different airlines and 700,000 hotels in their program, the possibilities are truly endless. Access unique experiences that are exclusive to Built members. Look, I wish I knew about this when I was a renter. So if you're currently renting, you've got to take advantage of this. It's so easy to turn your rent directly into rewards. If you're already paying rent, why not make it work for you? Start earning points on rent you're already paying by going to joinbuilt.com/lockedonnba. That's joinbuilt.com/lockedonnba. Make sure to use our link so that they know that we sent you. Don't wait. Start earning rewards today. Today's episode is also brought to you by Game Time. Look, if you're trying to buy tickets to go to an NBA game, Game Time is the best way to get your tickets. But it's not just for NBA games or any, sporting events. They've got tickets to concerts, theater events, whatever's happening near you. Game Time is the best ticket buying experience on the marketplace. They have their Game Time Picks feature that filters out the fluff to only show you incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of different ticketing offers. They've also got their Game Time ticket coverage, their lowest price guarantee, views from your seat, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive at your venue. But my personal favorite is their all-in pricing feature. When you download the Game Time app, you toggle on the all-in pricing feature, and they're fully transparent from start to finish. They don't try to hit you with the hidden fees or price gouge you at any point during the process. So take the guesswork out of buying your tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNBA. That's LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. And continuing on here at Locked On NBA Game Night, where we are focused on the buyers and sellers in the NBA landscape ahead of the NBA trade deadline. And David, the Pelicans have had such a rough season, just marred by injuries. They're floating around the bottom of the Western Conference. People had them pegged as, a team that could make some serious noise in the West coming into the season. They had that all-in move, or I guess it was an all-in move for DeJounte Murray, supposed to be the premier ball handler that team was missing and desperately needed to play alongside Ingram and Zion, and they still had questions about the fit and the pairing there. And now it feels like half the roster is up for grabs at this point, with Zion Williamson's contract at this point now becoming non-fully guaranteed or non-guaranteed now that he's missed X number of games so far this season. Credit to the Pelicans front office, though, for coming up with that ingenious way of, figuring out that contract and setting it up to kind of save themselves from this exact dilemma that they're currently sitting in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was a smart move, and they have to protect themselves with an injury player like that has such a constant and consistent, unfortunate history with injury and unavailability. I mean, you've got to be able to make sure that you don't have to wind up paying so much. I mean, it just, like, we keep hearing about this Pelicans team, and they're so interesting because you watch them and it just feels like they're almost required to make a move because this just isn't going to work. But again, almost similar to what I said about Jimmy Butler, like, do they really have to? It just seems like they were right there. Just things have gone so south so completely and so unexpectedly that it almost feels like maybe you just kind of hang on and hope for the best. But because this is already a lost season, you're not going to get anything in return that's necessarily going to help you this season. And if you're looking just to make a move for change's sake, I don't know. There's something about it that just feels innately counterintuitive to me.
Well, the real question here is, I do agree with you to an extent that the Pelicans are, if you wanted to just kick the can further down the road and just say, you know what, this is a lost season, fine, we're going to rest everybody, we're going to bench all the, impact players, and we're just going to try again next year. They could do that. They have their pick this season, right? So they can go all eyes towards the NBA draft, and they can hope to acquire one of the, amazing talent at the top of this year's NBA draft. That is a path that they could go, or an avenue that they could choose, and then, hope to run it back next season with everybody healthy. But At this point with Zion, a guy who has missed so much time, right? At what point do you just say, okay, we can't keep hanging our hat or, hoping our chances are going to, revolve around whether or not Zion is going to be healthy? We saw this Pelicans team without a healthy Zion actually make some noise and play some serious basketball. So what value, if any, does Zion actually have at this point? Is there a team out there that you could see being willing to take a chance on him? And at the end of that, if the Pels do trade Zion, how stupid would they look if Zion somehow turns it around and gets healthy and is playing, like a top 10, top 15 player when he is actually healthy?
Yeah, I don't know. It's such an interesting question because you look at all this talent in the world and you have to kind of just, it's almost like you have to be a franchise, now even as I'm saying it, I don't know if there's even a deal to be made there, but would the Charlotte Hornets be able to pull something like that together? Because it just feels like they need a player like Zion who you have to almost singularly build around. But it's almost like his name is the bigger draw rather than anything else. So obviously, he played collegiately in the North Carolina. So you could make the argument that maybe he might be that type of player to give this team that has lacked an identity for so long something to pin their kind of future on. But at the same time, it's such an incredible risk because while Zion, the name and the brand are huge and popular, Zion, the player, is not something that you can count on. And so it's taking an incredible risk. And I just don't know what market there is out there. Other than that, I'm not sure that there's another team out there looking at Zion Williamson and says, yeah, I'm willing to give up a significant amount of players, assets, whatever it takes in order to acquire him in the first place, knowing realistically he might not be able to play more than 40 to 50 games a year for the rest of his career.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, if you're Zion, it's when do we get into the territory of it? Is Zion a bust if he can't stay healthy?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I guess by definition, in terms of availability being one of the most important, if not the most important abilities, there's no question what he can do on the floor when he's out there, but you've got to be out there. And so if he's not, yeah, I mean, we can't look at guys like Sam Bowie and others that have suffered through career-defining injuries. Greg Oden, I hate bringing it up because that's a lot more recent than Bowie, but I mean, players that have gone through these issues and deal with injuries, and it's just the nature of it. So a bust, I mean, I hate the term. I don't want to use it. I feel it's just a rather unfortunate series of events that have led to them being unfulfilled potential, perhaps.
Unfulfilled potential is probably a much a more eloquent way of putting it. Unfortunately, I do I like your idea though for the Pelicans of just if they wanted to hold on and just run it back one more year and see if they can maintain if he can maintain health, and maybe that's the best avenue for them coming forward. Because again, like your point, I don't see it. Maybe the Raptors take a swing. Maybe the Wizards are desperate to if they really wanted to unload some of their draft capital, a couple young pieces. I just don't see a team that, because you're not going to trade for Zion and hope that he immediately turns you into a contender. That's not right. The way this works. It would be a team that really wants to take a Hail Mary swing and say, you know what? All right, it didn't work in New Orleans. Maybe it can work for us. And at that point, then, but that team maybe turns around and then Zion's playing.
Development name.
It really is at that point. Ingram is another more interesting one, but it kind of falls into the same conversation of, what's best for the Pelicans. There are a bunch of teams out there that would love to get their hands on Brandon Ingram, especially since his future in New Orleans has been so, I guess, murky to this point. Is there a landing spot that you think would be an ideal outcome for Brandon Ingram?
To me, it's probably the Denver Nuggets, I guess, and thinking about it, just somebody who could use that kind of combination of scoring and length and everything else like that, and just be able to kind of unlock another level of his game, playing alongside Nikola Jokić there. I mean, I think every player would benefit from playing alongside Jokić, obviously, but a guy like Ingram wouldn't be asked to do so much, and you've got a clear quarterback who can lead him and kind of steer him and put him in the right position to maximize what he can do. I think that's probably the best fit for him. Other than that, I can't really, there've been a lot of teams kind of flirting with the idea of adding a guy like Ingram. I just don't know if it's really real, if there's realistic deals out there that would make a huge deal of sense. Is there a name there that you see that might be a good place for him to land?
I mean, I come back to it. Definitely, you put any player next to Nikola Jokić, right, and they're going to be in the best position of their entire careers to flourish next to a 3-time MVP and a future first ballot Hall of Famer. I look up and down the teams that are, I guess, I'm trying to think of the teams that are actually going to be considered, I guess, buyers ahead of this deadline. And one of the other interesting teams that is a buyer, but I don't think that, or could be a buyer at the deadline, but I don't think they're necessarily the right fit for Brandon Ingram are the Atlanta Hawks, just based on how well they're playing to start. You don't think the Hawks are buyers this deadline?
I don't see why.
I'm not saying it for Ingram. I'm just saying the Hawks in general as potential buyers ahead of the deadline.
What is it that they're looking to add? I mean, they've got this depth that we talked about in last week's episode. They've got a good young core. They've got Trey there. Like it's funny to think that they're in a good position right now. They've got their Zachary Reshape. They've got a lot of players that are just really solid. And maybe there's a glut there. If anything, if there's a knock on this team, perhaps you could say that maybe there's too many players at one particular position, and you can move some. There's kind of a duplication of different talents out there, but it's working for them. And if you've got the defensive players and you've got the kind of mindset and you've got the coaching, I don't know. I don't see them as buyers necessarily. I just don't know that what move there's available for this Hawks team. I might just be anti-transactional and specifically, but I don't know. I just don't see the move for the Hawks specifically that's going to take them to that next level. They're kind of, to me, again, I think it's better for them to just kind of stand pat and see how far they can go this year and then kind of reevaluate at the end of the season.
They are in that interesting position, right, where they've got Trey. That's clearly their star guy. But then, you've got the upping, Jalen Johnson playing alongside of him. He's playing some incredible basketball this season, right? But he's not quite in that in that full star, and he's on a star level trajectory, right? And then Dyson Daniels is absolutely playing out of his mind, especially on the defensive side of the floor. They do have the interesting situation with Clint Capella and Onyeka Okongwu at the 5 spot, right? It feels like every single year Clint Capella has been in trade rumors. When are they going to move on from him? When aren't they going to move on from him? So maybe if somebody did shake loose that could fit, as far as, you're right though. I guess there's not like a direct upgrade on the roster. So maybe I'll have to, maybe I'll move it around and say that they're not buyers per se, but
yeah, maybe is this like an unfortunate byproduct? Because obviously, I don't think the league would ever care to admit this, but the transactional nature of the NBA has become so immensely vital to the league's importance and popularity continuing to grow, especially with the start of free agency and the draft and everything else. And maybe that's just the nature of just life in general, kind of following Adrian Wojnarowski and Woj bombs and Shams and everything else like that. What's going on with the tweets and everything, but. Like, it just almost feels like there's so much parity around the league, and there's so many teams that are kind of just like right in that same bubble. Like, we were going through the list of contenders. There's very few teams that you could look at right now as obvious contenders, and yet there's like half the league or more that's right there that's maybe considered to be one move away. But if they're all one move away, who the hell are you going to deal with? Like, who are you going to be able to engage in an active trades with other than the few teams that, as we mentioned before, are active sellers? Like, there's very few. And if everybody's going to Utah and everybody's going to all the other teams that we listed there as obvious sellers, and even in some cases like New Orleans, maybe they're not such obvious sellers. Like, there just might not be as many moves as possible. I don't know. It's an interesting kind of way of looking at it.
No, you're absolutely right. There is one team out there that is rumored to be looking to move on from a couple different names that they have on the roster. We didn't get a chance to talk about them this segment. We're going to talk about the Chicago Bulls. Zach LaVine, Nikola Vucevic. Could Zach LaVine be headed to the Denver Nuggets? Does that move work for Denver? Does it make them contenders? And we're going to talk about a couple other potential buyers ahead of this deadline, maybe some dark horse buyers, if you will. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one spot. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the exact same page where you actually place your bets. Just go to FanDuel.com to join today. And while you're there, take a look at all the different odds available. Check out their parlay builder. Check out the different season leaders, or just the outright favorites to win the Super Bowl. Right now, the odds are very, very close. The Bills sitting at plus 450. Right behind them, the Eagles at plus 480. You've got the Chiefs and the Lions both sitting at plus 500. And then in fifth place spot, you've got the Ravens at plus 800. So for all those odds and so much more, head on over to FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. And final segment here at Locked On NBA Game Night. We thank you for making Locked On NBA Game Night your first listen each and every day. For your second listen, go check out Locked On Heat with David Ramil. Come swing by Locked On Rockets with me, or find the Locked On Show for your favorite team. All right, David. The Denver Nuggets, rumored heavily to be interested in Zach LaVine, of all names. And Zach LaVine was a guy viewed widely around the NBA is one of the worst contracts in the league, still arguably one of the worst contracts in the league, even for a team that might be, dare I say, in a little bit of desperation mode. If you're the Nuggets, to find some way to, a player that they can add to kind of put themselves back in true title contention, I guess. Look, when you've got Nikola Jokić, when you've got the 3-time MVP, the best player on the planet, you're still a contender. But this Nuggets team is not the same Nuggets team from a couple years ago. It's not even the same Nuggets team from a season ago, right? They've had their issues. There's been times this season where they've been better without Jamal Murray on the court, because Russell Westbrook's been kind of a revelation for them at times this year. Do you like the idea of them adding Zach LaVine if it comes at the cost of Michael Porter Jr.? Do you like that swap for the Nuggets?
I don't know that it necessarily benefits them as much as you might think. Like, it provides that scoring. I've never been much of a believer in LaVine, and while he's having this incredible turnaround season and everything else, that's kind of more along the lines of what he was doing when he was making all-star appearances and things of that sort. I don't know. I feel like his numbers would take a significant dip. Like, being able to put up those numbers in Chicago that's a little different than having to fit a system that's kind of designed to win in Denver. So I don't know that he's necessarily going to continue to thrive there. I mean, he's going to get a lot of opportunities, but he kind of needs the ball in his hands. He's a little bit more ball dominant. I don't know that that's necessarily going to be the right fit alongside a guy like Jokić. And that salary, like, I mean, you're kind of tying your future to him in a way that you might not want to. So to me, it's a move that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense for the Nuggets to pursue. And I know that they kind of just need that boost offensively, but I mean, if you acquire LaVine, I mean, what does that say about your faith in Jamal Murray and what's going to happen with his future? I mean, does he even have a future in Denver at this point?
Yeah, I mean, look, Murray has just woefully underperformed so far this season. There's no way to paint it any differently. And the Nuggets are on the hook with him for his long-term contract. They're on the hook with MPJ. And unfortunately, it feels like MPJ is kind of the one piece that they can move. I would argue Aaron Gordon has more trade value than either of those guys, but Aaron Gordon feels important to what the Nuggets are trying to do. And he's the guy that I would argue is more untouchable than either of them, right? If you're trying to do something, if you're Denver and you're trying to, I don't say make a move just for the sake of making a move, but you want to be able to try and find some value somewhere else. And right now, this is not the Nuggets team that we had a couple years ago where everybody played their role perfectly and Murray was the perfect complement to Nikola Jokić, playing on the perimeter. They do need something. I don't like the idea of an MPJ for Zach LaVine swap, though. I don't think it pushes them any further forward. I think then you're just leaving yourself a bit of a hole at the 3 spot. And if anything, you're also downsizing, right? You become a much smaller team at that point. You're relying on the production from 3 separate guards to be able to get you over the top. You need the production from Murray still at that point. You would need the production from LaVine, and you're still going to try and find a way to get Russell Westbrook to have productive minutes. You're going to be running, 2 very small guard lineups at that point with Murray, Westbrook, LaVine, all 3 of those guys aren't exactly renowned world-class defenders, right? Your perimeter defense is not going to be great, and we know that Jokić has had his issues defending in the middle at times, so I don't like that move for Denver. I will pivot that, though, David, and I will say, we talked about the Rockets earlier with all their expiring contracts. How would you feel about Zach LaVine in Houston with offense being their Achilles heel for so much of this season?
That's a question for you to answer. I thought you were going to pivot and ask me, what do I think about Jimmy Butler going to the Nuggets, which, that seems like, I mean, again, from the Miami side, I don't think they'd have any interest in Porter Jr. As far as LaVine to the Rockets, how do you feel about it?
I love the move. I think if
you love the idea of paying Zach LaVine as much money as he's getting over the next couple of years to add some offense.
Well, yes and no. Look, if Jalen Green was averaging Zach LaVine's numbers right now, first off, he'd be in an all-star conversation, and the Rockets would be the number 1 seed in the West. I'm saying it right now. I'll say it right here on this show because that's been the Rockets' biggest issue. They don't have a consistent perimeter threat. Fred VanVleet is hot and cold every other game. Jalen Green has been more off than on this season, and that's been kind of the story of his career to this point. If you added Zach LaVine with his consistent outside scoring, he's having career years from the floor, shooting from the floor, from 3. Sure. You add that to the Rockets, and you keep them as top 2, top 3 defense on top of that. I think Ime Udoka could very easily get Zach LaVine to play some defense. I think that team becomes a real threat in the Western Conference. I'm not ready to say they're going to be outright contenders with that move, but if you can make that move with all of the expiring contracts the Rockets have and minimal draft capital. Here's my worry is I thought, okay, if the Nuggets get interested in LaVine, if there's 1 or 2 other teams out there that might want to take a flyer on him, then suddenly he goes from being one of the worst contracts in the NBA to there actually being a bidding war. My thing is if the Rockets can get their hands on LaVine with giving up just expiring contracts and 1 future pick possibly, then I say, why don't you make that deal? And you can cross the bridge when you come to, you figure out, the contract in and of itself a little bit later on. Yes, it sucks to be straddled to a $45 million deal for Zach LaVine for the next 2 seasons after this one. But if he gives you what you need, which is desperately offense, then I don't see how that's not a win for the Rockets.
You paint a pretty picture. Like you make a very convincing argument. And I guess, again, maybe it's just my own individual bias. I just don't know that he's going to continue to remain this consistent. Like, you think that taking him out of Chicago and the kind of approach that he's had, like you saw his numbers dip, and maybe you can make arguments about why those numbers dip, but he was playing alongside DeMar DeRozan and he wasn't quite the productive player. And then you go to a team like Houston with the idea that you're acquiring him and you need him to be able to contribute at a high level in order to win consistently. I don't know that he puts up the same kind of numbers. So again, similar to what I said about LaVine in Denver, I don't know that he's going to exactly translate that offensive production that we're seeing in Chicago and be able to transplant that with the Rockets.
I mean, all he would have to do in Houston is just knock down open catch and shoot threes. Houston just wants people who can knock down shots at this point, because Fred hasn't been able to do it. Jalen hasn't been able to do it. And the entire book is out on how to guard the Rockets. You collapse the defense in the middle. Şengün's going to kick it out to shooters that have been wildly inconsistent. And that's how you stop the Rockets offensively. Let's get to one of the other sellers. We talked about the Nets moving on from Dennis Schroeder a little bit earlier in the show, but the Nets have a few other pieces that could be on the move ahead of this deadline. They've got Cam Johnson, Dorian Finney-Smith, Cam Thomas possibly. Cam Johnson seems like one of the most, I guess, under the radar pickups that, he's on a good value contract. He would be, starting caliber for whatever team could potentially pick him up, or a really great depth piece if you did add him. And there were some question marks about, okay, what are the Nets ultimately going to do? We've had Adam Armbrecht, talking on this show about, just enjoying the vibes and enjoying competitive team. But Dennis Schroeder moving on from him, picking up only a couple second-round draft picks, that was the first sign that, okay, the Nets are going to be sellers. They're going to fire sale all these different guys. Is there a team out there? Well, first off, there's plenty of teams out there that would love to get their hands on Cam Johnson, Dorian Finney-Smith, yes. True kind of 3-and-D guys, right? But Cam Johnson's not even just a 3-and-D guy, right? He's a scorer. He can put the ball on the floor a little bit. He can drive. He can slash. He can pull up from the mid-range. Where do you think Cam Johnson fits? Who do you think would benefit most from picking up Cam Johnson ahead of the deadline?
I mean, we kind of just talked about the Nuggets. I think there's a team, again, they could use that kind of defensive presence. They could use a guy who could score from the perimeter. If you can wind up finding some kind of package in order to acquire a player like that. I mean, Dorian Finney-Smith kind of giving you a lot of what, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope was able to provide when they were making their championship runs and things of that sort. So like there are obviously fits there. Aside from that, I mean, you look at some of the top tier contenders. I don't think Cleveland needs to make any moves. Boston doesn't need to make any moves. Like they seem like they're pretty sure. Obviously, Oklahoma City looks like they're pretty good. I mean, you can make the argument. Would you want Cam Johnson in Houston? And I think that would certainly fit to a huge degree. Do you like that possibility?
Cam Johnson in Houston is definitely a guy that we've talked about over at Locked on Rockets a little bit. He was heavily linked, last season when the Rockets actually held the Brooklyn Nets future draft capital. They decided to move on from that. And now they hold the Phoenix Suns future draft capital in the palm of their hands. Cam Johnson's an interesting pickup, but it comes down to how desperate some of these teams, some of these sellers are, right? Are they simply just trying to get anything that they can get their hands on ahead of the deadline, or are they willing to be patient and create maybe a little bit of a bidding war? Because if you're talking about having to give up, one of the future members of the young core, like if you're talking about giving up an asset like, I don't know, Cam Whitmore or something, for a guy like Cam Johnson, I don't know if that makes sense if you're the Rockets, right? Are they in a position where, does it make sense to move on from, a talent, a guy who's shown a lot of potential like Cam Whitmore? Maybe it does, because the Rockets are kind of in this weird spot where they're ready to start playing competitive basketball, right? They're not in that rebuilding stage anymore where they're going to play bad basketball, where you can give these, young prospects who need a lot of developmental time, a lot of developmental runway time to grow and get better. They just don't have that opportunity anymore. So Cam Whitmore might be an unfortunate casualty of the Rockets' timeline being a little bit more accelerated, if you will, them being better and more competitive sooner than they probably thought they would be this season. And because of that, maybe he's a piece that you just say, okay, we don't have the time or the minutes to dedicate to developing this guy. So if we can, offload him and include him in a deal and maybe a future pick for a guy like a Cam Johnson to fill an offensive need that the team clearly has, then yeah, the Rockets could be a possible destination. I could see that fit possibly.
I like the Golden State Warriors too as one of those teams. But I mean, again, it's so hard to look at the Warriors and say, are they contenders? Like they had the hard start, and then obviously they've cooled off significantly, but they seem to be engaged. They made the Schroeder deal. They're linked to Jimmy Butler as a potential suitor. Like, I mean, a lot of people have Johnson linked to the Warriors as well. And I don't know that he necessarily goes to that team and takes them to a whole other level. I mean, the definition of what is a contender is much more hard to pin down in this season than it has been in past years. So I think it could go either way in terms of like a lot of activity building up to these trades or very little, because there might not just be the same number of suitors or partners that you might actually be able to engage and finish a deal with.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned earlier, right? It's so hard in today's NBA. There's so much parity across the league, and yes, there are clearly teams that are kind of floundering at the bottom of their respective conferences, and those teams do have players that could be utilized in other better situations. But at the same time, it's not as clear. I feel like in years past, it was clear night and day. Like, okay, this team's getting rid of these players. This team wants to move on from this guy. This team is clearly one piece away. We came into this episode thinking that it would be a little bit easier pinpointing, like, okay, this guy can go here and this guy can go here. We'll put our GM hats on and play with the trade machine and figure it out. And as we navigated this episode, which we kind of only loosely planned out, we realized kind of across the board, it's not as night and day as it used to be. I feel like figuring out how these teams can make improvements, what deals could be had at the trade deadline. There's a lot of rumors swirling. And of course, we're going to keep you posted for everything, all the discussion right here at Locked on NBA, whether it's Locked on NBA Game Night or our Locked on NBA midday show with Matt Moore, Hayes, and Doug from Locked on Hornets. So for all that, we do appreciate you guys for tuning into this episode. We're very curious your thoughts. What are some of the deals you would like to see take place ahead of this NBA trade deadline? Is your favorite team one of the buyers, one of the sellers ahead of the deadline? Let us know your thoughts in the YouTube comments, but we do appreciate you for tuning in. For your next listen, go find the Locked On Show for your favorite team. Until then, we will catch you guys on our very next game night.